Welcome back to History Class with Dr. W. We're continuing our discussion of World War I and the various combat theaters. And in this lecture, we move on to discussion of the major turning point of the war, the D-Day invasion. With the momentum of the war beginning to turn, as I discussed in the previous lecture, with the invasion of northern Africa and progress being made with the attack through Italy, and with the war in the Atlantic beginning to turn, Allied leaders decided by the summer of 1943 or so that it was time to begin planning in earnest for the attack that would open a second front into Europe, which would become D-Day. As I mentioned, Churchill and FDR met several times already, and there were calls to meet in person with Stalin. And so planning for one of the major wartime conferences, which would occur in Tehran, started that summer. And by November of 1943, the so-called Big Three of Stalin, FDR, and Churchill arranged to meet in Tehran, Iran. On the way to Iran, FDR and Churchill met in Cairo, over November 23rd through 26th, along with Chinese President Chiang Kai-shek. And the subject of their discussion mostly involved the conflict in the Pacific and some of the handling of the war against Japan and some of the attacks that would be made. And then in the aftermath, I suppose the biggest agreement coming out of Cairo was that Japan would be stripped of all of the Far Eastern territory it had seized really since before even World War I. But in Cairo, FDR and Churchill really didn't come to much agreement as to how they would handle Stalin a few days later in Tehran. And historians have noted that FDR was probably a bit naive in his ability to kind of dominate the discussions with Stalin. At one point, in fact, Roosevelt had written to Churchill saying, "I know you will not mind my being brutally frank when I tell you I think I can handle Stalin personally better than either your Foreign Office or my State Department. Stalin hates the guts of all of your top people. He thinks he likes me better, and I hope he will continue to do so." And FDR continued in a separate letter to one of his ambassadors. "I just have a hunch that Stalin doesn't want anything but security for his country. And I think that if I give him everything I possibly can, and ask nothing from him in return, noblesse oblige, he won't try to annex anything, and will work for a world of democracy and peace." So this suggests a sort of naivete in FDR, and Stalin's intentions and his ability to handle him. And it is in this meeting that we develop the phrase Uncle Joe and FDR and his handling of Stalin. And really throughout the proceedings, he's joking with Stalin, he's trying to establish a friendship, and in effect they're pushing Churchill a little bit to the side. You see that reflected to some degree in the picture on the screen. Churchill looks a little grumpy over in the corner. And so FDR is trying to establish this warm relationship with Stalin that ultimately history will show was never really possible. Churchill was frankly more realistic in his assessment of Stalin, telling one of his aides, "To make friends with Stalin would be equivalent to making friends with a python." For his part, Stalin was probably the most strategic and crafty of all of the Big Three. He was a chain smoker, a drinker. He had black teeth and yellow eyes and struck an imposing figure. But he was also a brilliant strategist and tactician, and played FDR and Churchill off against each other. As I've just previously mentioned, he was well aware of the sort of tender dynamic between FDR and Churchill. One of FDR's aides later described Stalin as a military brain of the highest caliber. He said, "Never once in any of his statements did he make any strategic error, nor did he ever fail to appreciate all the implications of a situation with a quick and unerring eye." As far as the conference itself, attention primarily focused on planning for what would become the D-Day invasion. The Big Three met several times over the course of several days, and conversation turned on when and how and where exactly the attack would take place. There was some discussion of who would lead the attack, and the decision settled on Dwight Eisenhower not long after the conference ended. And Stalin gave vague promises that once Germany was defeated, that the Russians would help British and American efforts in Japan. There was also preliminary discussion of what would happen in the aftermath of the war. What would happen to Germany, what would happen to France, Poland, and so on. And there were some preliminary attempts to carve up the map of Europe, although really those talks would focus more in the conferences to come at Yalta and Potsdam. By the end of the conference, FDR and Churchill had agreed that an invasion would be launched onto the mainland of France. The date had settled on May 1944. Of course, that would ultimately be delayed. And the conference concluded on the evening of Churchill's 69th birthday. And so a conference that had been filled with considerable tension ended on a relatively lighthearted and warm occasion. Each of the three made toasts to the others, and late in the evening, actually early into the next morning, FDR gave a toast saying, "We have proved here at Tehran that the varying ideals of our nations can come together in a harmonious whole, moving unitedly for the common good of ourselves and of the world. We can see in the sky, for the first time, that traditional symbol of hope, the rainbow." Well, this was perhaps a syrupy way to conclude the conference, and again reflects an element of naivete. But at least in that moment, the Allies are moving ahead with common purpose, and ultimately leading to the invasion of D-Day. Heading out of that conference in Tehran, the Allies began planning in earnest for the invasion of Normandy, which would take place beginning on June 6, 1944, the D-Day invasion. The American forces under General Dwight Eisenhower prepared for this cross-channel attack, which was codenamed Operation Overlord. And indeed, there were a dozen or more operations within Operation Overlord. There were many, many elements of this attack. This was the largest amphibious invasion in the history of the world, and continues up to this day. And we'll discuss some of the staggering statistics and forces involved. And of course, the Germans were prepared for such an attack. They had heavily fortified the cliffs and beaches of northern France. And while they didn't know exactly where and when the attack might come, the entire region had been heavily fortified. This would be an incredibly difficult battle. So I'll just discuss a few of the elements of this. This is one of the most written about, most discussed events in modern world history. And of course, there are dozens and dozens of movies made about it. I highly recommend the opening sequences of Saving Private Ryan for a depiction of the invasion itself and the beaches of Normandy. But some of the things that we need to mention, one of them was the weather. Weather was a serious obstacle, and throughout that spring and early summer, the weather was just poor in that part of the world, and so organizing this attack with so many different things trying to happen simultaneously, they needed the weather to be at least reasonably good. And also the tides were a very important element of that. So, tides kind of shift as over the course of a month, and there are only a few days out of each month when the tides would be right to get the boats and the men far enough up the beach to really successfully convey this attack. And so the weather continued to be bad, the tides were not cooperating, and it looked like the D-Day invasion might not occur in 1944 at all, because one of the other elements of the weather that had to be considered is what was going to happen next. just as Hitler was concerned about launching an invasion into Russia because of the impending winter, the Allies also confronted realities about what would come in the months ahead. And so it looked like the attack might not occur, but finally, on June 6, 1944, the weather cooperated just enough, and Eisenhower agreed that this is the day that we will launch the attack. All did not go smoothly on that morning. The weather continued to be bad. The seas were rough, visibility was poor. Many ships and planes did not arrive exactly where they were needed. One aspect of the attack were paratroopers that were sent and dropped up on the cliffs themselves, and those paratroopers were scattered all over the countryside. Nonetheless, the invasion was, of course, ultimately successful, and in this picture you get a sense of the massive undertaking involving hundreds of ships and more than 150,000 men, which took to the beaches that day. There were many other elements of this that we should discuss. One of them was a misdirection campaign, which was known as Operation Fortitude, a deception campaign to fool the Germans so they wouldn't know exactly where the attack was going to come. Now you can get a sense from this map of the extent of the invasion. You see there were 5 separate beaches where the invasion was launched: Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juneau, and Sword. And the Allied invading force was divided up into different groups launching the invasion. The most sort of infamous and notorious and the harshest conditions were at Omaha Beach, which was almost exclusively American forces, and the fighting was fiercest there. But as far as this misdirection campaign, you can see the English Channel is actually narrowest up in this section, which is known as the Pas de Calais, the Calais Pass, between England and France. And so the Allied forces massed a fake army over in this part of England, which included tents and so on that were painted to look like tanks or other armaments from above. They even at one point sent a dead body floating across the channel with papers that suggested the attack would come there instead of the Normandy beaches where it ultimately occurred. And this misdirection campaign was successful, or at least successful enough to aid the progress of the Allies on D-Day and the days that followed, because Hitler in particular was convinced that the attack at Omaha was a feint, a misdirection, and that the real attack was still to come in the area of the Pas de Calais. And so Hitler himself delayed sending reinforcements to the Normandy beaches, and ultimately the attack succeeded. Nonetheless, it was an incredibly difficult attack and cost the lives of thousands of men, as the waters were heavily defended and fortified. There were mines and other kinds of obstacles placed throughout the shallow water and up the beaches, creating incredibly harsh conditions for the soldiers who made the attack. Nonetheless, despite those conditions, ultimately the Allied forces were successful, managed to achieve a beachhead, as you see here, and over the following days and weeks, the war would move to the countryside of France, ultimately inching closer to Germany and ultimate victory.